The last thing I need to build for this paneling system is the bottom rail and the top rail. The bottom rail is 3.5 inches wide. On the back side of it, I've got a 3/4 by 3/4 inch piece of wood attached. Now that essentially is going to create a shelf where the paneling will sit down on top of this, and it'll kind of hide the ends of that paneling. The top piece is 2.5 inches wide, 3/4 inches thick, and it also has a piece of 3/4 by 3/4 attached to it, but that's been attached to the top surface so that it's flush. Hopefully that when this gets all burnt and stained, it'll kind of blend in and make it appear to be one solid piece of lumber. And on both of these, I've just eased the corners off with a 45-degree angle. I wanted to do this hasty mock-up just to make sure everything fit well. And it's a good thing I did, because I did discover a potential problem. So when I first put this together, and I put the base molding on here, I realized that there was a 1/4 inch gap right here. And the problem that I kind of foresaw was that if this base molding gets bumped hard enough, it might cantilever this out, it might pull the paneling away from the wall, certainly would pull the base molding away from the wall. So I needed to do something to prevent the bottom of this from ever getting pushed inward. What I'm going to do is take a 1/4 inch wide strip, and I'm going to glue it down towards the bottom of this base mold. Now when I put it up against the wall, everything's tight, everything's flush, and nothing can move. Now that I know everything's going to work, let's go to the shop. We'll build the top and bottom rail. For the top and bottom trim, I'm starting with a 1x8, and I'm going to rip it down to size. I'll end up with a 3.5 inch strip, 2.5 inch strip, and then a little left over that I'll rip down to 3/4 of an inch. Now that we've got the finish on here, I need to do one more thing, and then we can start the installation process. I need to take the bottom rail and make a notch for that base molding on the adjoining wall. I don't need to do anything to the top rail. Let's go get that notch taken care of, and we can start installing some panels. Oh yeah, there is one more thing I have to do before I can start the installation. That is, we got to clear some things out of the way. At some point during the installation process, you're going to have to contend with outlets on the wall. When we get closer to this one, I'll show you how I'm going to deal with that one. The first one I have to worry about is a coax. Now, the reality is, this is just a fake coax. There used to be cable routed to this one. That cable has since been removed. So I don't have to do anything about this one except run my paneling to cover that up. If that did have a coax sticking out of there without a box, all I would have to do is drill a hole through the panel that goes over this and then just reinstall the plate. Before I start permanently mounting anything on this paneling system, I want to get a couple of measurements. I want to measure from the ceiling down to the bottom rail, and I want to make sure that the distance on both ends is the same, because the reality is not all walls are plumb and not all rooms are square in a house. They'd like you to think that's the case, but that's not always true. So I'm going to measure to the top of this bottom rail on this end and on the other end, and then any differences I'm going to take out by moving the board either up or down. After taking several measurements of this wall, I finally picked a measurement from the ceiling down that's going to represent the top of that bottom rail. And what I've done is I've placed marks along this wall at that measurement. I've got one here, and then I've basically got them, about every 3 or 4 feet along this wall. Keep in mind when you're making that measurement from the ceiling down, make sure it works across the entire wall. In this case, with the bottom rail over there, I can move this board up or down to meet that mark, and everything lines up really good. Now when you install this paneling system, top and bottom rail, you want these things fastened to something secure. In this case, I'm going to go for the studs that are in the wall. Now if you have a stud finder, they're pretty easy to locate. I don't have a decent stud finder, but I do know that where this outlet is, the studs are 16 inches on center. So all I have to do is figure out what side of that outlet box the stud is, and then just start measuring over 16 inches. And I'll just mark those 16-inch increments on the back side of this bottom rail. And then I can pre-drill and start to use some finish nails to put that in place. That solid sound indicates that the stud is on this side of that box. So essentially the center of that stud is going to be about right here. And then I can start measuring 16 inches off of there, and that will give me the next stud in the wall. If you feel the need to actually look at the back side of this plate to find out where that stud is, you can take this plate off, and that will reveal the box behind it. Make sure that you turn off the power so that you don't get a rude awakening. I'm just going to score this. For some reason, this cover plate is sticking to the paint. Now, it's not a huge deal. I don't want to tear the sheetrock apart. But this whole outlet box is going to be in a whole new state of mind when we're all said and done here. Now, by looking at the edge of this box, the studs are about 1.5 inches wide. So 3/4 of an inch over from there is going to be where the center of that stud is. And that's where I'll take my measurement from and start marking off in 16-inch increments. While I've got this mark exposed, I'm going to take the measurement and I'm going to put another mark a little bit higher so that when I do my top rail, I'll be able to get my 16-inch on center mark. So I've got the bottom rail butted up into that corner, nice and tight. This is ultimately where it's going to sit. I'm going to take this mark on the wall and just basically transfer it down roughly. This doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm going to make a mark on that inside ledge. And now I'm going to go every 16 inches off of that so that I know where I need to pre-drill for my finish nail. So I don't want to admit, but I've been burnt on this house before thinking that all the studs should be right where they're supposed to be. So I did a little exploratory drilling here kind of below the line, and it turns out that my first mark away from that outlet, there's nothing solid behind there. Now I did some further down the line, and I was hitting the stud all the way down the rest of the wall. So I'm not really sure what's going on back here, but we got to figure this out. Let's do a little exploring, shall we? Now that's solid. I moved over 3/4 of an inch, which theoretically should be half the width of that stud, and found something solid there. Could be that this one was off a little when they built this wall or board. Could be some void in here that I happened to hit. Either way, I'll move things over just a little bit from this original mark. Everything else is good. To secure the bottom rail to the wall, the plan originally was just to use these 2-inch finish nails. I have a bunch of these left over, and it's really hard for me to find projects to get rid of them. But as I was thinking this through, after the fact, which usually happens, by the time I go through the bottom rail, this 3/4 inch spacer, I've only got roughly 1/2 inch of that nail protruding. And that's just the thickness of the sheetrock there. So I'm not going to get into any of the framework behind the wall. So a couple of things I'm going to do. One of them is when I put these nails in, I'm going to try and bury them into the bottom rail a little bit, try and get into that framework. The other thing I'll do is lower on the bottom rail, I'll drive some finish nails. These finish nails will actually go into the base molding that's on the wall behind there. Between the top nail and the lower nail, that should be enough to hold that bottom rail in place. I've decided to start on this end of the bottom rail, mostly because this sits a little low of the mark so that I can raise it up, hold it in place, pre-drill and drive this first nail. Further down the line, I've got a couple of spots that are a little bit high, which means I'll have to push down on the bottom rail to get it lined up with that mark. And then I've got a couple of marks that are right on the money. So this one, for me, right now seems like the most logical starting point. So I'm just going to raise this up so that the top of this bottom rail is even with that mark that I've got. And again, those marks are the marks from the ceiling. And I'm going to make myself a little easier reference mark to kind of work from back here. Now for this first hole, and actually all the holes that I'm going to be using for the top nails, I'm coming down about 1 1/8 inches and pre-drilling these. Really, I'm just pre-drilling through this bottom rail. Because I don't want that to split. Now we'll just get a nail in here, get it kind of started. And before it starts going into the wall, raise this up. Check our marks again. this mark is actually below the surface here, so I need to push this down while I'm driving that nail. I finished the bottom rail by trimming down this smaller piece. I cut a 45 degree on this end, and then I just nibbled away at the length until I had that just right. I also cut the notch here for the base molding. The boards for the paneling themselves should go pretty quick. I've gone ahead and put a mark above where that top rail is going to be, indicating where the framing is. When a board comes across and lands on the framing, I'll use a few finish nails to hold that board in there and give it a good connection to the wall. Where I have a seam that's not on the framing, I'll just take my nail gun and drive a few 1-inch brad nails in there, kind of hold those two boards together. And then with each board, I'm going to use a 2-foot level and make sure that it's standing perfectly vertical. And if there's any variation, I can kind of take that out as we move down, so that when you stand back you won't see the paneling starting to tilt. As I'm picking boards for the paneling, there's a couple of things I want to be paying attention to, because I want to avoid anything that looks like a pattern. So I'm going to try and pick them at random. I've got various widths. I should be okay in that aspect. When I get close to this outlet, I want to make sure that I've got one of my wider boards centered on that outlet. I have to cut a rectangle out so that I can use that outlet, and I've got an outlet extender box. I've never used one before, so we're going to try that, see how that works. It should be just fine. By using a wider board, I should have plenty of wood around that cutout. I don't lose any strength and it doesn't fall apart on me. Now it's time to deal with the outlet. Well, I've got my board picked out, and my goal was to center this as much as possible in this board. Now I need to just figure out where I got to cut this hole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark, I'm not going to mark anything with that pencil. Hang on. Okay. So I'm going to mark roughly where the inside of this box sits, here and here. I'm using the inside of the box because I've got this extender, and basically what happens, this slides inside the hole we're going to put in this board here, and then it fits on the inside of the existing box. So the hole that I cut in this board is going to be made for this dimension, not for this box. Then I'm also going to replace this with a brown outlet and a brown cover. So I've got those two marked there on that board, making sure that everything is where I want it to be. Now I can take this board, set it down in the bottom rail, making sure that it's down all the way, and I can make a couple of marks on here. So those marks and those marks represent the inside dimensions. Now all I have to do is trace them onto this board here, and then I can cut this out. what I'm doing now is just making sure that when I cut this hole out that I've got enough wood here to support these tabs, because that is basically what my new wall plate is going to mount to. And that looks good. We'll cut on the inside of those lines a little bit. So we're going to drill from the face side down, because I know when this drill bit goes through, we're going to have blowout. Make sure the power's off to this outlet. Now I'm going to swap this out for the brown one. What I'm really hoping is that the wires that connect to this outlet are long enough to allow me that 3/4 of an inch offset. Got multiple wires here, blacks on this side, whites on this side, ground over here. And when you look at these screws, you'll see that the black goes into the brass colored screws and the white goes into the silver colored screws. I've got plenty of wire here, so we're just going to swap this out, and these should be pretty easy if I can get these clamps where the wires push in to release the wire. I had to get a skinnier screwdriver so that I can get in here and try and release these tabs that hold that wire pinch. Now, monkeying around with these wires, if you're not comfortable with that, don't do it. Have somebody else rewire this for you. If you're wondering how much wire you should have exposed, a lot of these outlets have a gauge here. So when I put this wire on here, yeah, it's about 1/4 inch too long. So I'm going to trim all of these down. And I knew they were too long before I even got to this point, but okay. Then the 2 screws that are in the outlet get replaced with the longer ones that are part of this little extension kit. And those will just screw right back into the existing box. Okay, with the hard part done, now it's back to more of the same. We should be able to cruise along pretty good at this point. So every now and then I've got a board with a really cool feature. But when I put this up here, I see the color of the wall behind that, and I'm not really thrilled about that. So what I kind of want to do is figure out a way to just make the wall disappear. I think the easiest approach for me to try is get some flat black spray paint and just spray that general area. Well, it looked like the camera needed a break, so I forged ahead without it. And really, it was just a repeat of the same process. What it ultimately boils down to is put a board in, brad nail it to the one behind it, and then when I get to a stud, put some finish nails in there and move on to the next one. And I did that down the entire line. Now I suspected it would be tough to get this last piece in if I went ahead and installed this one here. So I left this one out, and I've got this one trimmed down to size. Now I've also really roughly here kind of eased this back corner, because these corners of your sheetrock aren't always a sharp 90 degree. There's old paint and there's sheetrock mud and all kinds of stuff that builds in there. So if it feels like your wood is being pushed away from the corners, just knock those edges off a little bit and it'll make your life a lot easier. So we're going to put this piece in here, slide it tight back into the corner, and then this one we can tuck around underneath and then slide it in there. Now these two are ready to be nailed in place. Alright, the last thing we got to do is install that top rail. Putting this top rail on is going to be really simple and really straightforward. The nicest thing about this is I don't need to notch those corners to fit them in there. They're essentially going to sit down on top, and then everywhere there's a stud, we'll put a nail in there. And I don't know if you can see it real well, but in that corner I've kind of eased the top rail just to fit in there so that it fits as snug as possible. Well, I'm going to call this one done. I'm pretty happy with the way things turned out. There are a few things that didn't quite work out the way I'd envisioned them, but that happens with every project. One thing that I wish was a little bit different is that I wish these knots would have been a little higher up on the wall. But I think that's just because I picked the wrong corner to start, and therefore they ended up down lower. But that's okay. Besides that, it's too late now. Again, like I said, I'm pretty happy with this. I got the feel that I was after. It was a lot of work. I put a lot of energy into prepping this wood to get it on the wall, but the price of it was just right. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something, and thanks for watching.